The General Slocum, How a Church Picnic Became the Deadliest Disaster in New York City History. June 15, 1904, East River, New York City. Part 1. The Morning of the Picnic, 9 a.m. June 15, 1904, 3rd Street Pier, Manhattan, New York City. It is a Wednesday morning in early summer, and the Lower East Side of Manhattan is alive with a particular kind of joy that comes only once a year. The women have been up since before dawn. The children have been impossible to manage since the night before, too excited to sleep, asking the same questions over and over. Will there be games? Will there be music? Will we swim? The fathers who are coming have pressed their best suits. The mothers have put their daughters in white dresses and their sons in sailor suits. Everybody has their good shoes on. Everybody has their hair done. This is the annual excursion of St. Mark's Evangelical Lutheran Church, and it is the social event of the year. The neighborhood they are leaving this morning is called Klein Deutschland, Little Germany. It fills the blocks between Houston Street and 14th Street on the eastern side of Manhattan. Its residents, first and second generation German immigrants, have built in the heart of the largest English-speaking city on earth, a community that functions almost entirely in their native language. They have their own newspapers, their own theaters, their own beer halls, their own butchers and bakers and clockmakers and tailors, all operating in German. They have their own churches, their own schools, their own social organizations. They have built something remarkable, a piece of the old country transplanted into the new one, thriving and growing and fully convinced of its own permanence. St. Mark's Church on 6th Street is the center of this community, and the annual Sunday school picnic is the highlight of the social calendar. A day trip by steamboat up the East River and Long Island Sound to Locust Grove, where there would be picnic tables and green grass and games for the children and music for the adults. A day away from the tenements, a day of summer and light. More than 1,300 people are boarding the General Slocum at the 3rd Street Pier this morning. The General Slocum is a side-wheel steamboat, 3 decks, white painted, festooned with flags and bunting for the occasion. She is 13 years old. She has run aground 5 times. She has had 3 collisions. Her crew has been cited for incompetence. Her fire safety equipment has been inspected repeatedly and found adequate. This finding of adequacy was, in the most literal possible sense, a lie. The fire hoses had not been properly tested in years. Their canvas rotted from lack of maintenance. When water pressure was applied, they burst. The life preservers, 2,500 of them, enough for every person on board with hundreds to spare, had been manufactured in 1891. 13 years without being replaced. Their cork flotation material had long since crumbled. To pass inspection without the expense of replacement, iron bars had been inserted into the canvas. Iron bars, in life preservers, on a passenger steamboat carrying women and children on the East River. The lifeboats were secured to their davits with iron wire that had corroded over years of exposure to river air. They could not be launched quickly. In a rapid emergency, they could not be launched at all. The Steamboat Inspection Service had inspected the General Slocum 5 times in the previous year. On each occasion, the inspector had found everything satisfactory. On each occasion, the inspector had not actually tested the equipment. Part 2. What burned? The fire started in a storage room on the main deck, a room called the lamp room, where oil, paint, and flammable materials were stored. It started sometime between 9:30 and 9:40 in the morning, shortly after the boat left the pier. A 12-year-old boy named Frank Perditsky noticed the smoke first. He reported it to a crew member. The crew member told him to mind his own business. By the time the fire was actually reported to the captain, it had been burning for perhaps 10 minutes. The captain was William Van Scheck, a 67-year-old mariner with 40 years of experience on the rivers and harbors of New York. When Van Scheck was informed of the fire, the boat was passing 97th Street on the East River, a location with accessible banks, piers, and beaches where the boat could have been immediately run aground and the passengers evacuated. He did not beach the boat there. Instead, he continued north, toward North Brother Island, approximately 2 miles away. 2 miles. At the speed of a side-wheel steamboat, approximately 5 minutes. 5 minutes during which the fire, now fed by the wind of the boat's own passage, spread from the lamp room through the forward section of the main deck and then upward into the upper decks where most of the passengers were. The crew attempted to fight the fire with the fire hoses. The hoses burst when the pressure was applied. The crew attempted to throw the life preservers to passengers. The life preservers, when soaked with water, became heavy with the iron bars inside them. They pulled their wearers beneath the surface. The crew attempted to launch the lifeboats. The wire holding the lifeboats in their davits had corroded solid. The boats could not be moved. The passengers had nowhere to go. The upper decks were on fire. The main deck was on fire. And the life preservers that should have kept them afloat were killing them. Some women, driven by the fire, jumped into the water holding their children. The children went under with the weight of the iron-ballasted life preservers. Some women jumped without the preservers and drowned because they could not swim. Some people stayed on the burning upper deck until the deck itself collapsed, dropping them into the fire below. The General Slocum ran aground on North Brother Island at approximately 10:09 a.m. The fire had been burning for less than 30 minutes. When rescuers reached the General Slocum, the boat was fully involved in fire from stem to stern. 3 decks burning. The hull burning. The paddle wheel stopped. In the water around the boat and along the shoreline, rescuers found hundreds of people clinging to debris, or floating face down, or simply gone. Part 3. The Island. North Brother Island was the site of Riverside Hospital, a quarantine facility for patients with infectious diseases. The nurses and orderlies who worked there were the first organized responders. They waded into the water along the rocky shoreline, pulling people out, giving their own clothes to survivors who had been burned, carrying children up the rocky bank. They worked for hours. By noon on June 15th, the death toll was already known to be catastrophic. Bodies were being pulled from the East River as far south as 90th Street, where the current had carried them. Bodies were washing up on the shores of the Bronx and Queens. Bodies were found in the shallow water around North Brother Island, resting on the bottom in places where the water was not deep enough to hide them. The official death toll settled eventually at 1,021. 1,021 people. On a Wednesday morning in June, on a church picnic. Almost all of them from one neighborhood. Almost all of them from one community. Klein Deutschland lost in a single morning more people than it had lost in any previous event in its history. Entire families were wiped out. Streets that had been full of German-speaking women and children on Tuesday morning were silent on Wednesday afternoon. Some of the dead were not identified for weeks. Some were never identified at all. The men of Klein Deutschland came home on Wednesday evening to find their wives and children gone. Some of them never recovered. Some committed suicide. Some left the neighborhood immediately, unable to live in streets where every face and every building reminded them of what they had lost. The neighborhood never recovered. Within a few years, Klein Deutschland had essentially ceased to exist as a coherent German-American community. The survivors moved away. New immigrants took their place. The community that had built its churches and its schools and its social organizations over half a century was dispersed by grief and by the impossibility of living among the ruins of everything it had been. The disaster did not destroy the neighborhood, but the disaster broke the spirit that held it together, and the neighborhood dissolved. Part 4. The Investigation. The investigation produced findings that were unambiguous in their attribution of responsibility. The life preservers were examined. Inspectors found that the cork was crumbling and degraded, in some cases almost entirely dissolved. Iron bars had been inserted into the canvas to give the preservers the correct weight on an inspector's scale. The preservers were useless. They had been useless for years. They had been inspected and certified as adequate, repeatedly. The fire hoses were rotten, degraded by age and neglect to the point where water pressure caused them to burst. Inspected and certified as adequate. The lifeboats, the wire securing them was corroded solid. They could not have been launched in any emergency. Inspected and certified as adequate. The inspector who had most recently certified all of this was a man named Henry Lundberg. Lundberg had been inspecting vessels on the East River for years, earning a comfortable government salary while doing the minimum possible work. A pattern of negligence, or corruption, that was endemic in the steamboat inspection service of the era. The Steamboat Inspection Service existed specifically to prevent disasters like the General Slocum fire. It had the authority to require that equipment be maintained and replaced. It had the authority to refuse certification to vessels whose equipment was unsafe. It had, apparently, an institutional culture in which inspectors who found equipment inadequate were encouraged to find reasons to certify it anyway, because inadequate findings meant more work, more conflict, and more friction with the powerful steamboat companies whose goodwill made everyone's life easier. Frank Barnaby was the president of the Knickerbocker Steamboat Company, which owned and operated the General Slocum. Barnaby had known, or should have known, that the equipment on his fleet was not being properly maintained. The economics of his business created strong incentives to delay equipment replacement. New life preservers cost money. Properly maintained fire hoses cost money. And the Steamboat Inspection Service had demonstrated over many years that it would certify equipment without actually testing it. Why spend money replacing equipment that inspectors were going to certify anyway? This is the logic of the General Slocum disaster. Not malice, not accident, but the systematic intersection of financial incentive, institutional corruption, and regulatory failure. The money that Barnaby did not spend on life preservers was profit. The inspections that Lundberg conducted without testing were comfortable government work rather than serious public safety. The result of these two intersecting failures: 1,021 dead on a Wednesday morning in June. Part 5. The Reckoning. Captain William Van Schaik was convicted of criminal negligence, sentenced to 10 years in prison. The only person actually imprisoned. He served 3.5 years, then was pardoned by President Taft, at the urging of former crew members who felt he had been unjustly singled out. Van Schaik's conviction was, in a strict sense, defensible. He had made decisions that contributed to the death toll, most notably the decision to continue north rather than beach the vessel immediately. But the framing of the disaster as primarily the captain's fault obscured the systemic failures that had created the conditions in which any fire on the General Slocum was going to be catastrophic. Rotten fire hoses, iron bars in life preservers, corroded lifeboat davits. These were not decisions Captain Van Schaik made on the morning of June 15th. These were the accumulated consequences of years of regulatory failure and corporate negligence. Inspector Henry Lundberg was convicted of neglect of duty, sentenced to 18 months. He served less than a year. Frank Barnaby, the president of the company that owned the General Slocum, was never charged with a crime. A federal grand jury indicted him. The charges were eventually dismissed. He lived out his life in comfortable circumstances. His company continued to operate. The Steamboat Inspection Service was investigated and found to have been systematically dysfunctional. Inspectors rubber-stamping equipment as adequate without testing it. Supervisors looking the other way. The entire apparatus of safety regulation operating as theater rather than as actual protection. Several inspectors were dismissed or resigned. The service was reorganized. New procedures were implemented. These reforms were real. They improved the safety of the steamboat industry. They came, as all such reforms come, too late for the 1,021 people who had already died. Part 6. What was lost? 1,021 dead. In a neighborhood of perhaps 35,000 people. Nearly 1 in 30 of the entire population of Klein-Deutschland dead in a single morning. But the mathematics of community loss work differently from the mathematics of random loss. The dead from the General Slocum were not distributed randomly across New York City. They were concentrated, almost entirely, in a single neighborhood. A single community. A single social network. The annual excursion of St. Mark's Church was organized through the church's social networks. The people who came to the 3rd Street Pier on the morning of June 15th were the women of the congregation and their children. The fathers were at work. The men were largely absent. The passengers were overwhelmingly female, overwhelmingly young. When more than 1,000 of them died, what died with them was not just individual lives. What died was the social infrastructure of a community. The women who had organized the church bazaars and the Sunday school classes and the neighborhood social events. They were gone. The children who would have grown up to be the next generation, a disproportionate number of them, were gone. The knowledge, the relationships, the institutional memory of a community that had been building itself in New York for half a century. Much of it went into the East River on June 15, 1904. The men of Klein-Deutschland came home on Wednesday evening to find their wives and children gone. Some never recovered. Some left the neighborhood immediately, unable to live in streets where every face reminded them of what they had lost. By 1910, Klein-Deutschland had effectively ceased to exist as a German-American neighborhood. The streets that had been the center of a world were changed forever. The churches converted or torn down. The community gone. Part 7. The pattern. The General Slocum disaster fits a template that recurs throughout American industrial history with a regularity that should by now be familiar. A regulated industry, a regulatory agency with the authority and the mandate to prevent disasters. A systematic failure by that agency to enforce the regulations it was supposed to enforce. Corporate operators who exploited the regulatory failure to reduce their costs. Equipment certified as safe while being demonstrably dangerous. A catastrophe. Criminal investigations, prosecutions that reach the operational employees, the captain, the inspector, while leaving the corporate principles largely untouched. Reforms. And then, the slow erosion of those reforms as the memory of the disaster fades and the economic incentives to cut corners reassert themselves. The fire hoses on the General Slocum were certified as adequate because the inspector who certified them did not test them. The life preservers were certified as adequate because the inspector who certified them did not put them in water. The lifeboats were certified as adequate because the inspector who certified them did not try to launch them. Adequate on paper, fatal in practice. This gap between paper adequacy and practical safety is not unique to the steamboat industry of 1904. It exists wherever regulated industries have successfully influenced their regulators to accept less rigorous standards. Wherever the economics of inspection create incentives for inspectors to find equipment adequate rather than inadequate. Wherever the consequences of finding inadequacy fall on the inspector, while the consequences of actual failure fall on the public. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, 7 years after the General Slocum, killed 146 garment workers. A building with inadequate fire escapes, locked exit doors, no sprinkler system. New York City inspectors had visited the building. The conditions were known. The exit doors were locked to prevent the largely female immigrant workforce from stealing. The doors stayed locked because the factory owners had the political connections to ensure that building code enforcement was lax. 146 women died on a Saturday afternoon. The pattern? Known risk, inadequate regulation, corporate exploitation of regulatory weakness. Catastrophe. It has not ended. Epilogue. The East River still runs past the Lower East Side of Manhattan. There is a small memorial to the victims of the General Slocum in Tompkins Square Park, placed there in 1905 by the survivors of the disaster. It shows two children, a boy and a girl, reaching toward each other. It is modest, weathered, surrounded by the ordinary life of a New York City park. Most people who walk past it do not know what it commemorates. Most people who live in the neighborhood it was placed to remember have no connection to the German-American community that built the neighborhood and was destroyed by the disaster. On June 15th every year, a small ceremony is held at the memorial. A few dozen people attend. A pastor says a prayer. The names of the dead are read. The list takes a while to read. Anna Heinzmann, age 6. Frida Baumann, age 8. Maria Kleinhans, age 11. Margaret Bohm, age 34. Else Pfeiffer, age 28. Katharina Werner, age 41, and 1,000 others. From the streets of Klein-Deutschland, from the Sunday school of St. Mark's Church, from the tenements of the Lower East Side, they went on a picnic. The fire hoses burst. The life preservers sank. The lifeboats would not launch. The inspector who certified all of it as adequate served less than a year in prison. The company president was never convicted of anything. The captain served 3 years and was then pardoned. 1,021 dead, almost all of them women and children, from one neighborhood, on one morning, in 1 hour. The deadliest disaster in New York City history. A company president who was never convicted. A regulatory agency certifying rotten equipment for years. Not one meaningful reform until after the dead were counted. They went on a picnic. Remember the General Slocum,